Yeah, step one for any factoring problem is find the GCF. There's always a GCF. Yeah, if you don't find one other than one, it's just one, okay? So step one in any factoring problem is find the GCF. When you have four or more, now we've been dealing with terms that had, or problems that had two terms, we had problems that had three terms, and now we're going to have four or more terms. So if you have four or more terms, you need to factor by grouping. This involves placing parentheses around terms to try to make GCFs appear, okay? So for example, we have 3n to the third minus 12n squared plus 2n minus 8. Here's what you're going to do. Most important 10 seconds of class right now. Put parentheses around the first two terms. Put parentheses around the last two terms, and I'm going to leave that plus sign in the middle. What I've done is I've grouped these two terms, and I've grouped these two terms. All right? Remember, parentheses are called grouping symbols. So these are grouping symbols, these are grouping symbols. Now I've made two groups. So what I'm going to do now is in the groups, I'm going to pull out a GCF. So I'm going to find a GCF here and pull it out and write what's left over. I'm going to find a GCF here and pull it out and write what's left over. Okay? So let me do that. The GCF for the first group is what? 3 what? 3n squared. Open up parentheses, what's left over? From the first one, 3n to the third divided by 3n squared is just n, or n times 3n squared is 3n to the third. And then I have what? Minus 4. Close the parentheses. Now the second one, I'm going to pull out a GCF. So I have a plus sign sitting here, and I'm saying the GCF is 2, so I'm going to write plus 2, and then parentheses, n minus 4. And this is where factoring by grouping gets kind of interesting, or fun, or tricky, or hard, or however you want to look at it. What we have here basically is two terms. I have a term here, and I have a term here. What we did up here when we had two terms was we factored out the GCF, right? Here we had two terms, so we factored out the GCF. Here we have a term, and here we have a term. So how many terms total do I have? If this one thing right here is a term, and this one thing right here is a term, there's actually two terms. So we're going to look for a GCF between these two terms. Is there one? Actually, what do you see in the parentheses? N minus 4 is in both of those terms. Okay, it looks a lot different than the GCF did up here, but actually there is a GCF between these two terms. It's n minus 4, that whole thing. The whole thing in parentheses is a common factor. So I'm going to pull that out. When we factor out a GCF, we write the GCF out front, so that will be n minus 4. And then we open up parentheses, and we write what's left over. So what's left over after I pull the n minus 4 out of this term? 3n squared. And what's left over after I pull n minus 4 out of this term? Plus 2. That's the answer. So in the end, you have to factor out, you have to draw your grouping symbols. You got to factor a GCF out of each group, which is what we did. And then look inside the parentheses, see if there's another GCF. If there is, factor that whole thing out, and then write what's left over. And then you have your answer. This is the answer. How could we check that? Yeah, FOIL it back out. You do want to check it to make sure you're right. Because some of you still aren't doing that, and you're still getting grades of like 3s and 4s and 5s on your homework, and you shouldn't be. N minus 4 times 3n squared plus 2. FOIL it. N times 3n squared is 3n to the third. N times 2 is plus 2n. Negative 4 times 3n squared is negative 12n squared. And then negative 4 plus 2 is negative 8. That's right. 3n to the third, right there. negative 12n squared right there, 2n right there, and then that negative 8 is right there. We're just in a different order, but is this the same thing? Yeah, it is. So this is the correct answer. We checked it. We know it's right. Now we can move on. Factor 8t to the third plus 14t squared plus 20t plus 35. What do we do first? Group them. So how should I group them? The first term and the second term. And then what? How do I draw the first parentheses on there, though? Am I going to include the plus sign? No, don't include the plus sign. There you go. In Algebra 1, this is how you're going to do your grouping. It's almost, I can almost guarantee you it's going to look like that every single time. In Algebra 2, sometimes we have to move things around a little bit. You don't have to worry about that here. Just going to group like this. Now what do we do? Greatest common factor of 8t to the third and 14t squared is 2t squared. Good. And what's left over? What? N. T? Just T?
No, 14.
4t plus 7. 2t squared times 4t is 8t to the third. I have to have that 4 there. And then 2t squared times 7 is 14t squared. That closes the parentheses there. Now what?
And then you take the plus.
Plus,
And then you take the plus after that one.
yeah, is 5. So I write the 5 and then parentheses
14
4t
plus 7.
plus 7. And right away, what do you notice?
They're the same.
The things in the parentheses are exactly the same. So that is what? That's another GCF. So we're going to pull that GCF out. And what will I write? And then what's left over is, and that's the answer. So we've seen two problems now. Maybe it's clicking, maybe it's not. Hopefully it's making a little bit more sense. Watch out when you group and there's a minus sign in between the groups. Like up here we had two groups and we had a plus sign in between. When there's a minus sign in between, you need to be very careful that you don't, what I call, hack the minus sign off of that third term. Okay? So what we're going to do is fix this negative sign here. A negative is just addition of, a minus sign is just addition of a negative number. So I'm going to do a quick change here. This is going to turn into a plus, and that'll turn into a negative 5r. Now I have that plus sign that I want in between. Always make sure there's a plus sign in between your groups. That will prevent you from making sign mistakes. So now I'm going to draw in my groups here. I'm going to leave that plus sign out, and that's a negative 5r minus 30 inside. Now what? GCF of the first group is what? 2r squared. Parentheses, what's left over? R plus 6. Close the parentheses. Then I have the plus sign. What's the GCF of negative 5r minus 30? Good, it's actually negative 5. So I'm going to pull the plus sign down and then I'm going to factor out the negative 5. Parentheses, what's left over? R, no, R plus 6. Distribute there in your head, just distribute this to make sure it works. Negative 5 times r is negative 5r. Negative 5 times positive 6 is negative 30. So we have that correct now. Also, notice inside the parentheses, what? Yeah, they're the same. So what do we do now? It is a GCF, so we factor it out, and we have r plus 6, and then parentheses, what's left over? 2r squared minus 5. You could write plus negative 5, or you could write minus 5. At this point, I think we all know that that should just be minus. There you go. Step one is always GCF. We're doing GCF and then we're doing GCF. And then you might have to do another GCF. So, what do we do first on this first problem? Find a GCF. What's the GCF here? 4y. 4 goes into all 4 of these terms, and also y goes into all 4 of these terms. So I have a GCF of 4y. Open up parentheses, what's left over? Y to the third minus 2y squared plus 3y minus 6. Close the parentheses. So the GCF is pulled out. Now we got to keep going. We have 4 terms inside the parentheses here. So what are we going to do with those 4 terms? We're going to group them. I'll group here. I'm going to leave the plus sign out, and I'm going to group here. Now what am I going to do? GCF inside those groups. Yeah, so I'm going to write my original GCF, 4y. And now I have too many parentheses, so there's another symbol we can use besides parentheses. Yeah, we can use the brackets. So I'm going to switch to brackets, just so I don't get confused. And then the GCF of y to the third minus 2y squared is what? Y squared. Open up parentheses, and what's left over? Y minus 2. All right, close the parentheses. Now, second group, what's the GCF here? Yeah, so I'm going to write plus 3, open up parentheses, and what's left over? Y minus 2. Close the parentheses, and then also we're done, so we're going to close the bracket. Now, it's very complicated. I'm looking inside here. What do we notice? The y minus 2 is a GCF that's going to get factored out to right there. So I'm going to write 4y. I can write my bracket. Then my y minus 2 in parentheses. And then what's left over? Y squared plus 3. Close the parentheses, close the bracket. Now notice this is all multiplication here. 4y times this thing times this thing. Do I need the brackets? No, I don't need the brackets. So my actual answer here is 4y, parentheses, y minus 2, parentheses, y squared plus 3. Yeah, now it's just that there's a GCF out front that you have to include in the end. Pretty fun problem, huh? Sure, it's fine. Yep, as long as you get to the answer in the end and it's right, I don't care. All right, so what should we probably do first on this problem? Look for a GCF. 3H. All right, so what do I have left over then?
2
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Close the parentheses. Now what? Now draw in your grouping symbols. So I'm going to group here and here, and then group here and here. Now what? So the 3H is still out front, right? Bracket, because I don't want to get confused. The GCF of this group is h squared, that's correct. Parentheses, 2h plus 3, good. Yeah, the GCF here is 2, and then what? 2h plus 3 is left over. And then close the bracket. And what do you notice? There's a GCF here inside these parentheses. They are the same, so I can factor those out to right there. Will I need the brackets anymore? Nope. So I can write, what's my answer? This is what's left over. I pull the 2h plus 3 out, and I'm left with h squared. I pull the 2h plus 3 out, and I'm left with 2. All my parentheses are closed. That's the answer. So question, is 6 minus a the same as negative 1 times a minus 6? What do you think? Some yeses and some nos. What I can do is distribute the negative 1 in, and if I do that, I get negative a plus 6. Can I rearrange these and have 6 minus a? Yeah, so 6 minus a is the same as negative 1 times a minus 6. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because sometimes in parentheses, like maybe you have in parentheses on one term 6 minus a, and in parentheses on the other term you have a minus 6. You can actually make these things match by factoring out a negative 1. That'll change this around to 6 minus a, and now you do have a GCF here and here that you can factor out. So watch out for that trick. If the numbers all match up, it's just that the signs are opposite, factor a negative 1 out as well, and then you'll have matching numbers and signs. And that's what's going to happen on these problems here. So the first thing we should do is probably what? GCF. Do we have a GCF here? No. So now what do we do? Grouping. Okay, so we draw our groups. Leave that plus sign in between. Now what? GCF of my first group is 2m, and I'm left with k minus 6. Good. And the GCF for my second group is, so plus 7, and I'm left with 6 minus k. All right, look in the parentheses. Do these match exactly? No, they don't. But what, could I do my trick up here to make this thing turn around so that it does match? Yeah, you could. So actually, instead of a positive 7, I should factor a negative 7 out. So I'm going to make this a minus 7 instead, which will make this a, what kind of 6? A negative 6, and this will be positive k. Now do these match? Yeah, I don't need to rewrite it. I know that they match, so now I can factor out that GCF, which is k minus 6 times what's left over here, 2m, and what's left over here, minus 7. That is the answer. So it's just a trick that you might come across when you're doing these problems. So make sure you're watching out to make sure that these things actually do exactly match. If they don't exactly match, pull a negative out and maybe they'll switch around for you and they will match then. All right, what should we do on this second one here? No GCF, so grouping. Oops, I accidentally drew that over the plus. Okay, now what? C times 1, good. 2D. Okay, and then GCF is 4 2D minus 1. All right, does the stuff inside the parentheses match up exactly? Almost. They just have wrong signs, right? So instead of a positive 4 factored out, I'm going to factor out a negative 4, and that will make this negative and this positive. And now do they match? Yeah, they do. So what do we factor out? 1 minus 2d times c minus 4. That's the answer. Okay, third one. What do we do first? Is there a GCF here? Okay, so now what? Good. Remember that first trick that I told you. When you make your grouping symbols, you cannot have a minus sign here. So I have to do a quick change here. Change that to a plus, change that negative to a negative 18p. And now I can draw in my grouping symbols. Now we have a plus sign in between. That is so important. GCF of the first group is just P? Okay. 1P times 2P. Now what? GCF is, I heard 9, so we'll go with 9. Parentheses, not 2P, negative 2P, plus 3. Okay, look inside the groups of parentheses. Do those match? Yeah. Actually, they do. Notice that the terms are in the wrong order, but the signs are correct. It's a positive 3 and a negative 2P. It's a positive 3 and a negative 2P. These actually do match, so we don't have to do that trick on this page. We're already good to go. So what will I write? And then what's left over is P plus 9. Okay, so you got 2 tricks with these. Make sure you do not hack the minus sign off of that third term. Do a change to make that a plus, a negative term. And also watch for making sure that your factors inside the parentheses actually do exactly match. If they don't, you may be able to factor a negative sign out and change those signs around so that they do exactly match. We put a box around my answer here just because we're excited that we actually got that right. Chapter summary, factor out the greatest common factor. That's always step 1. Look, even the book says it. Step 1, factor out the GCF. Then, if the polynomial has 2 terms or 3 terms, look for a difference of squares. That's what we learned yesterday. Perfect square trinomial, what we learned yesterday. Or a pair of binomial factors. That's going to be the box method. If the polynomial has 4 or more terms, group the terms like we were just doing to factor out common factors again and again. Finally, check to make sure that there are no common factors other than 1. Look inside this answer right here. Is there a GCF here other than 1? No. Is there a GCF here other than 1? No. So that's how we know that this is the completely factored answer. Triangle. Okay, yep, triangle works. All right, that's it. The rest of the time is yours to do homework.